All right, welcome back and congratulations for making it this far in the course. We are finished with the Enlightenment, we are finished with Puritanism, we're finished with the two movements that most of my students detest the most. They're fully necessary, as you'll see when we get into the quote-unquote good stuff with modernism, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Faulkner, so on and so forth. You'll see that there's an enormous payoff to having read the Puritans, to having read the authors of the American Enlightenment, that there's a whole world of American literature that you miss had you not done the prerequisites. And so, for that reason, when I've taught this course, I spent an entire quarter just going over Puritanism and the Enlightenment, actually a little bit more than a quarter. Whereas most American literature survey courses in high school only spend, 3 or 4 days on the Puritans. You might read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. You may read an excerpt of the autobiography of Ben Franklin. For the most part, that entire period is skipped over. And even in many collegiate programs, those two periods are brushed over. Well, not here. As you may know, that was actually my initial concentration. I wanted to do stuff with American Puritan authors. I was fascinated by the Puritans, still am fascinated by the Puritans, and I worked with an amazing scholar of American Puritanism out at UCLA. We did a lot with early American religious history. There's some interesting stuff there. But in any case, I felt the need to spend a lot of time there. But now we're getting into the stuff that I like more and that students in general tend to like more, which is Romanticism. And to give you some context, I put up here a timeline of American literary history that I made and produced for my students and for my high school students. They actually have to memorize this, be able to reproduce it in a test. It's one of the earliest assignments that they have. And it is not a complete timeline of American literary history. It's meant to be an outline, but it's mostly for students who don't know how to orient themselves in American history yet. My students were juniors. They're just starting taking American history. Some of them will be taking APUSH. And they don't really quite know the timeline of American history that well, and the timeline of American literary history is even more complicated. So to help orient them, I created this timeline. But I want to show you this to give you a sense. So we have the Puritans, which is the first 100 years of American literature, which, as mentioned, even though it takes up a quarter of American literary history, you spend maybe 2 or 3 days on it maximum. But in any case, we've got the Puritan period from 1630 to 1740, and some major authors, again, not a complete list of authors, but authors you know, Winthrop Mather, Jonathan Edwards, guys that we've gone over at this point. American Enlightenment, 1740, roughly to about 1800, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Philip Freneau, as well as the other authors that we looked at. And then what you'll see here is that in Romanticism, we have an explosion of different literary schools. So Romanticism does not last as long as the other two movements. It's only about 60 years, 1800 to roughly the beginning of the Civil War, 1861. But we have three major literary movements, and we have like a wide range of important canonical authors that we have to look at. And this is where we start, like when people think of American literature prior in the 19th century, prior to modernism, they're going to think of, your Edgar Allan Poes, or your Nathaniel Hawthornes, or your Herman Melvilles, or your Emersons, right? Those are the authors that stand out in our minds as the American authors worth reading. And so we're finally getting to this period where we have an explosion of literary forms. We start to see novels, we start to see essays, we start to see a lot more poetry, we start to see drama, we start to see short stories, all of the things that make up what most of us consider to be literature, rather than just sermons, tracts, journalistic works. We now have a true explosion in literary forms, which is quite nice, and also a diversity of different styles. And in fact, there's a fourth school that's not on here that we are going to talk about in this survey course. I omit it for my students because there's just not enough time during the year, and I'd rather get to these schools than talk about them. But just so you know, there are four schools. The first is the Knickerbocker School, 1790s, 1820s. It's the first major American literary school that is centered outside of New England. We have literature coming out of New York, and this is your Washington Irving, William Cullen Bryant, to a certain extent James Fenimore Cooper. And then we have transcendentalism. And so transcendentalism is probably the most important American literary movement. I make the case, I'll make it here, I've made it in previous classes, that after Emerson writes Nature, all of American literature for the next 100 years is in some sense a response to nature. Up until, I would say, really the end of World War II, we have about 100 years of response to nature. And I think that's very accurate. And the way that I'm going to approach this course is going to involve that. But you probably have some sense of the transcendentalists being very important authors. We have about a 20-year period here. And then beginning towards the middle of that period, we start to see Fireside School of Poets, the Fireside Poets. This is going to be your Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Holmes, so on and so forth. Like numerous authors that you may be familiar with from maybe like poetry surveys, from freshman surveys of literature, so on and so forth. Following that, we have the Gothic authors, 1840s to 1860s, the post-transcendentalism period. All of these authors are what we could say a negative response to or a critique of the excessive optimism that we see in transcendentalism. This is Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, and a couple others. And then, of course, later movements, realism, local color, which we've talked about a bit in the Unit on American Identity, naturalism, modernism, postmodernism, with a sampling of authors from each. Now, this is not a lecture on the timeline, but it does give you some sense that Romanticism is extremely important both in terms of American literature more broadly and also in this course. There's 4 major movements within this 60-year period. And the idea that I want to get at here before we start to talk about the Romanticism notes is that Romanticism in the American context is crucially important. And in fact, of all the European nations that go through Romantic movements, so you could talk about English Romanticism, French Romanticism, German Romanticism, to a certain degree, Spanish and Portuguese Romanticism, though somewhat attenuated. You could go Polish Romanticism. You could look at all the different movements throughout Europe. Greek Romanticism. None of them are as powerful as German Romanticism and American Romanticism. Now, obviously, America, not a European nation, but of like all the countries in the West, broadly speaking, that go through Romantic movements, they are most powerful in Germany and America. And something that we want to talk about in this course, and we'll talk about it particularly with Transcendentalism. You'll see this if you read great work. I recommend taking a look at Barbara Packer's The Transcendentalists. She was a professor out at UCLA. Didn't have the good fortune of having met her. She passed away about a decade before I got to UCLA. But I read her book. It's phenomenal. She was a very, very good scholar. And one of the things she highlights in that work is the affinities between American culture and German culture, which is something now that seems quite extraordinary because in the period of World War I and World War II, obviously there's a huge anti-German sentiment, largely, you could say, imposed from above, right? But there's like a very strong anti-German people, anti-Teutonic culture element that comes in from propaganda in World War I and World War II. Sorry, we're not just talking about like ideological, like being against fascism or being against Nazism, but actually there's something wrong with the Germanic people, with the Germanic ways of thinking, with Germanic art. And if you look at that, you would go, well, this is weird that American culture has this affinity with Germany, but it's actually not that strange. So one thing that Barbara Packer highlights is the fact that the first American doctoral students, like people to receive PhDs, they go and study in Germany. And the reason for that is, if you were to look to Europe, where the center of non-Anglican Protestant culture is, well, it's going to be Germany. And so for that reason, all these Boston sons of ministers, they want to go travel in Germany. They want to study under the German higher critics like Schleiermacher. They want to study the Bible the German way and want to learn from Germans because they see Germany in some sense as being a model for what America could be. It is a Protestant nation. It shares a lot of similar things, right? We talk about German work ethic the way we talk about American work ethic. Well, everybody knows Americans among the global peoples have a reputation for being very hardworking, for working long hours, for taking pride in their work, and the same is true of Germans. Well, part of that has to do with Protestant cultures, especially if you take a look at a wonderful book, highly recommend, The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism by Max Weber. Very good work on that topic. He talks a lot about Ben Franklin, and I believe I mention him. I haven't done the lecture yet, but chronologically speaking, it should be mentioned in the lectures I'm going to give on Ben Franklin. Max Weber talks a lot about Franklin as being a sort of model subject of the Protestant state, of the Protestant worldview. And so there are a lot of affinities between America and Germany, and Romanticism really takes off to a high degree in both of those countries. And in fact, I would say among English language Romanticism, the American tradition of Romantics is a lot stronger than the British tradition, which you may know. Your Wordsworths, your Shelleys, your Byrons. I would say those authors, both aesthetically and also in terms of, how should I say this, the influence of like the Romantic current or ideology upon their thinking and upon their aesthetic is not as strong as it was on the American authors. But this is a claim I'm going to make later. What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about just Romanticism in general as a sort of pan-Western, pan-European movement. And so these are general characteristics that apply to British Romanticism, that apply to a certain extent to German Romanticism, and that certainly apply to American Romanticism. And so we're just going to look at the Romantic movement as a whole. And then later we'll look at specific American contexts in separate lectures. So we'll have a unit where we go over the notes on the Knickerbocker School, early American nationalism, early American Romanticism, with a nice painting by Cole, very relevant. Later we have a lot of notes on transcendentalism, followed by Gothic, or what's sometimes called dark Romanticism. But today we're just going to stick to talking about Romanticism in general. I have a list of 7 characteristics that I think you should memorize. You should learn these terms, learn how to use them. There will be unit vocab as well. We'll go over that in a separate PowerPoint. But with no further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So, characteristics. Where does Romanticism come from? What we talk about in intellectual history, everything is always a reaction to and a borrowing from. So when we went over the Enlightenment, you probably saw this. There are certain elements of Enlightenment thinking, particularly in the American context, that are borrowings from Puritanism. They're just secularizations of Puritan ideas. So instead of talking about a congregational ecclesiology, we take the principles of that ecclesiology, secularize them, and then we put them in the political sphere. And so we get the political philosophy of elected government, republicanism. You take covenant theology, which is a sacred hermeneutical principle for interpreting the Bible. It becomes secularized into government by way of contract, talking about the social contract, talking about Bill of Rights, Constitution, so on and so forth. And so there is a degree of continuity between Puritans and the Enlightenment. And of course, as I've mentioned numerous times, it's the descendants of the Puritans who are most in favor of separation and independence in 1776, whereas the descendants of the Anglicans and the Catholics in the South are much more in favor of quote-unquote loyalty to the monarchy. They do not want to establish a republic for the most part. That's a generalization, but it's a generalization that's pretty apt. So there are continuities between Puritanism and Enlightenment. However, there are also strong reactions to Puritanism. So one of the foundational ideological principles of Puritanism is the idea of TULIP, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, perseverance of the saints. And with the foundational belief being total depravity. Human beings do not have free will. Every single human thought, action, word, and deed is in some way sinful, and we cannot do anything right of our own accord. We are in complete and total dependence upon God. Well, the Enlightenment thinkers, as we saw when we went over the Enlightenment note sheet, the Enlightenment key vocab, as well as the literature, what do they believe? The total opposite, that human beings have absolute free will, that human beings are born tabula rasa, they're born blank slates without any original sin or innate ideas, they're innately good, and they can be made perfect through the exercise of reason and virtue. So in that sense, it's a sort of dialectical opposite to what we see in Puritanism. So there are continuities on the one hand, but there are also oppositions and reactions on the other. Well, something similar is true in Romanticism. So a major continuity between Romanticism and the Enlightenment is the idea that nature is good. So for the Enlightenment thinkers, you'll recall, we see this in like Philip Freneau's On the Religion of Nature as a clear example. Because a deistic God set the universe in motion, because we are rational, and because the universe is rational, the study of nature allows us insight into the mind of the Creator, who is the absolute good, who is the one, who is the monad, who is the deistic watchmaker. And so therefore, the study of scientific laws is inherently good and is rational, and the only way we can accumulate those experiences and accumulate this new knowledge is through the study of nature. In Romanticism, there is a high value placed on nature, as I'm sure you're already aware of. However, there is a slight difference, and we're going to see this. In the neoclassical schema, in the Enlightenment schema, the idea is that nature is ordered. So we love nature because nature is a reflection of order. It's a reflection of the mathematical laws of the universe, of symmetry, of proportion, of beauty. And so the classical image of the Enlightenment in nature is the garden. The garden is well ordered. The garden represents what human beings are going to do to the wilderness of this earth, to put it in a rational arrangement, to put it in geometrical arrangement, to put everything in sort of mathematical, harmonious proportions. You'll see this if you listen to the music of Mozart. That idea of symmetry, of proportion, of mathematics, of everything having its proper place in the universe and having harmony is very present in Mozart's music. And in fact, we're going to have a little subunit on music later. But comparing that to Romanticism, the Romantics obviously put a high value on nature. Anyone who's read any of Wordsworth's poetry or knows anything about Emerson is going to know, okay, there is a high value placed on nature in Romanticism broadly throughout the European context, but also in the American context. But the difference is nature is prized for the opposite reason. Nature is prized because it is wild. It is untamed. It is savage. It is a reflection of human passions and emotions. So the idea here is that when we look out in nature from the romantic view, we do not see the symmetry of the watchmaker god, we do not see the divine intelligence or the mathematical proportions of the universe or a reflection of our own rationality. What instead we see are our passions. Intense love, intense hatred, intense fear. Like all of the intense emotions that the Enlightenment feared, right? Because the whole Enlightenment idea is use reason to dominate the emotions and the passions, and by becoming more rational, become more virtuous. By becoming more virtuous, become happier. Well, take a look at this Caspar David Friedrich painting that you've probably seen before, The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. Let's go back. Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. You'll notice, is this harmonious, symmetrical nature? No. You have jagged edges. You have the fog pointing in different directions across the canvas. It's dynamic composition. The colors are reflective of a sort of vibrance, of an emotional intensity. And you have the wanderer standing above this cliff where he's in danger, right? You've got, again, the jagged edge of his walking stick. His legs are pointing off in different directions. Arms, everything is going diagonally. And everything is shooting off in different directions. There's a certain order to it. It's proportional, but it's not symmetrical. It's not geometrical. It's not reflective of a mathematical order. Rather, the idea here is human life is about great, big emotions, passions, and feelings. And so any passion or emotion, even if it's destructive, is itself a good thing for a romantic author. The important things are the big feelings, broadly speaking. And so what this painting is reflective of is the idea that like life has this inherent grandeur, splendor, and beauty that cannot be fully reduced to the rational way of thinking, that in many ways goes beyond a purely rational way of thinking and points to something beyond. Or if it doesn't point to something beyond, at least shows that the human soul has jagged edges that cannot be fully explained by a rationalistic worldview. This is the Enlightenment idea. So again, the reaction to the neoclassical form of thinking, the reaction to the idea that the mind is rational and that we're capable of, through scientific inquiry and experience, of acquiring more knowledge about the universe. In fact, there's an intense skepticism towards reason and the scientific method. You may go, well, why is that? I think two major currents, they're not the only reasons, but two major currents that help explain that. So one, the outcome of the French Revolution. Everybody recognizes the French Revolution is a tremendous failure in almost every regard, and there's a sense that we used all of the scientific developments of the 18th century not to increase human happiness, not to build a paradise upon the earth, but to invent the guillotine, which is the most efficient means of killing someone ever invented up to that point. We used you'll see this in Blake, for example. If you read any of William Blake's poetry, you'll know Blake's whole philosophy about science and industrialization is we have used all of these scientific developments to essentially enslave mankind in new, more sophisticated ways. So we put children in factories. We have these sort of awful like smokestacks and are destroying the natural environment, polluting the natural environment through industrialism. So there's a sort of sense that the scientific progress that was promised in the 18th century actually just enslaved us more. And so maybe there's a limit to reason. If reason is going to bring us to the terror and to the guillotine, maybe actually we should put reason in check. And it's not totally wrong. I mean, you may think, well, the French Revolution is the result of human passions. That's kind of what Edmund Burke says. But the Romantic thinkers look at the French Revolution and they go, no, this is not the result of human passions. This is the result of an excess trust in man's rational capacity. Because, of course, they did things like they turned Notre Dame Cathedral into, the cult of the supreme being, right? And they enshrined a prostitute and had her as Lady Reason. Some ridiculous thing like that. You obviously have the development, like everything now proceeds on the metric scale, right? The months are built in sets of 10. So we have Thermidor as a month, Florial as a month, like all these ridiculous 10 sets of systems of time on the metric scale. Like you see all these different developments that are intended to make life more rational. But of course, anyone who looks at the period 1791 to 1800 in France is going to realize it's chaos. And so the Romantic thinkers look at that and go, okay, yes, human beings are innately good. Yes, there's beauty in human life. No, we are not predetermined to do evil things. We agree with the getting rid of revelation from the human experience. We think those were positive developments in the Enlightenment. But the negative development of the Enlightenment is an excessive trust in reason, and also aesthetically too much attachment to the Greco-Roman past and not enough originality, which is something I highly agree with. Is one of the things I find most genial about the Romantic thinkers is that they look at this awful neoclassical poetry, or people, whatever, trying to imitate the odes of Pindar, or people trying to use dactylic hexameter, or in English, which actually does happen in Romanticism, but we'll put that point aside for a moment. Or people trying to copy like Roman tragedies and comedies and bring them into the modern context. They look at like this sort of slavish desire to be like Greece and Rome, and the Romantics say, Greece and Rome, not that great. Why? Well, because Greco-Roman culture was predicated on this excessive rationality, on war, on all these different oppressive institutions that we disagree with. And so actually the Romantic thinkers look back at the Middle Ages very fondly. And this is more true in the English context than it is in the American context, though there is some of this in the American context as well. But like the British Romantics in particular, I mean, you see this Wordsworth, like lines about Tintern Abbey, in lots of Wordsworth's poetry. In Coleridge, in parts of Byron, you'll see this, not as much in Shelley, but it's sort of like, hey, I am not Catholic. I do not agree with Roman Catholicism as a religion or an ideology, but there was something so beautiful about the Catholic Middle Ages, and they view it as a sort of time of mankind's innocence. They view it as like the time when men were children. And so they, in some sense, they share the Enlightenment worldview, because remember, the Christian, broadly speaking, like the worldview of Christendom, when they look at historiography, is Greece and Rome getting better, Rome perfect pagan civilization but still insufficient. Christendom perfects Rome, we get the new Rome of the eternal Rome of the papacy, and then in the early modern period of the Renaissance, things start going downhill, and then the Enlightenment is the beginning of the end. And things just get worse and worse and worse until the Second Coming. That's essentially the Christian historiography. Whereas the Enlightenment historiography is what? Greece and Rome, pretty good, things get more and more rational. Dark Ages, the church comes in, we lose all reason, everybody's running around with poop on their heads, and then America picks up where Greece and Rome left off, and America is going to be the third and eternal republic. Exactly what you saw in Philip Furnau's poetry. In, on Mr. Paine's Rights of Man. Well, what are the Romantics going to say? The Romantics are going to look back and go, Greece and Rome, like Greece, okay, there were aspects of Greece that were good, that were irrational, the mystery religions, right, the Dionysian intoxication, like they go, yeah, those are good things. Tragedy, those are nice. And then they look at the Roman world and they go, the Roman world is actually inferior to the Greek world. It's too rational, it's too hyper-ordered, masculine, focused on war, not enough room for creativity, spontaneity, art, so on and so forth. And then they say, but then Christianity came. And everything became irrational again. So they agree with the Enlightenment thinkers. The Enlightenment thinkers actually say, yeah, like Christianity and the 1,000-year period of Christendom was irrational. Whereas the thinkers of Christendom would say this was the period of the highest rationality. It was the period of the development of scholastic theology. It was the period of the development of the monasteries. It was the period of all these different scientific and technological discoveries. Human beings were closer to God. Social institutions were more just, so on and so forth. The Enlightenment thinker says, no, this was irrational. The Romantic thinker agrees and says, yes, the Middle Ages were irrational, but that irrationality was quite beautiful. It resembled the irrationality of the child. And so they look back at that period very fondly, looking back to the past for imagination. Skipped ahead a little bit, but it's an important point. Because the whole idea is, what is irrational in human beings? All of those things are actually the best parts of the human experience. So whether it be intense sexual passion, whether it be intense romance, like you see this in Tristan and Isolde, the romantic opera by Wagner. We're going to talk a lot about Wagner, actually. Whether it be intense anger, the desire for revenge. You'll see this in the Count of Monte Cristo, French Romanticism. Like the passion for revenge that grips a human being. Whether it be even intense greed and luxury, take your pick of the human experience. Intense fear in the Gothic. When human beings hit limit experiences, there's beauty. This is the Romantic thesis. And for that reason, they love children. And so this is where we start to see children for the first time in the West as something beautiful in themselves. Because in the in the period of the Enlightenment, in the period of Christendom, there was a general understanding by both sides of the issue that children are incomplete. right? So like the Enlightenment thinkers are like, you are a potentially rational being, but you're not there yet, and we have to discipline you so that you become rational, and then one day you'll become a man like everyone else, and that's a good thing. You'll be rational. But the child is like, it's not there yet. And for the Christian thinkers, they say, no, the child is closer to original sin, is closer to the wounds of the fall, and has to receive graces through the church and be educated by the church in order to become a human being who has dominated the passions and who can act as like a just Christian man in society. But both the Enlightenment thinkers and the Christian figures are going to view children with skepticism. The Romantic figures are the first who are going to look at children and go, there is something innately beautiful and good about being a child, precisely because, well, for the reason that the Enlightenment thinkers didn't see this as good. The Enlightenment thinkers see this as a period of irrationality. We're going to say that irrationality is actually what makes childhood a very beautiful and desirable thing. So again, this blends into point two. Romantics privilege the imagination, or what is often called fancy, and things reason cannot cover because reason is flawed. So a lot of the Romantic subjects are going to be about things that could never possibly happen. Or they're going to be reviving of folk tales, of legends. So for example, Wagner's set of operas, The Ring Cycle, is an attempt to revive Germanic, pagan mythos and bring it to stage. Because the whole point is, precisely because these things do not conform to the scientific mode of knowing, we think they're beautiful. You'll see this early on in the American context. Washington Irving, who writes really the first short stories that we have in America, in something like Rip Van Winkle, the whole point of the story is that it's talking about this delightful thing that would have drove a man like Thomas Jefferson crazy. What do you mean there's elves in the wood who have these parties and they're playing nine pins and they drink magic beer that makes you fall asleep? Like, this is ridiculous. This could never, there's nothing scientific or rational about this. But for the Enlightenment thinkers, talking about magic, folk tales, legends, mythology, gods and goddesses, like those types of things were seen as very beautiful because they went against the rationalistic mode of thinking. And so kind of regard for nature, we already talked about that a little bit, and a belief in the sublime. And the sublime is one of these key concepts you want to make sure you get down in order to understand Romanticism. There are multiple different varieties of sublime. We're not going to get to all of them, like the difference between Kant's sublime and Burke's sublime, the negative sublime. I mean, we'll talk about the negative sublime when we get into Gothic, dark Romanticism. But just so you have some idea, the idea of a sublime experience involves two things. One, it defies all calculation. And what that means is when you are in an experience of something that is truly sublime, you cannot think rationally. So you're not thinking about finances, dollars and cents. You're not thinking scientifically. You're not in control of yourself. You're not in control of your emotions or passions. At that moment, you are so overwhelmed by whatever is going on, you are not thinking rationally. And it also involves a closeness to death. So any truly sublime experience brings one to the limit of one's existence, where there is a certain death, whether it's a metaphorical death, like an ego death, meaning like you forget that you exist, or like you're actually close to death. So I put some examples here. Like a good example of a sublime experience would be if you're on a beach and a tidal wave is coming, you see like the ocean go back in, and then the tidal wave is coming at you. You're in danger and you're not thinking rationally. And it's intensely beautiful. That's another aspect of it as well. It's like you're seeing the beauty and overwhelming force of nature. And the idea is, when you experience the sublime, you realize unconsciously that human reason is only 1% of the equation. And that in the human soul, there is so much more beauty and experience than we can express rationally. And so when you see the tidal wave coming at you, you think, oh my goodness, if the tidal wave has this much strength, vitality, beauty, passion, and fury, how much more beauty, strength, passion, and fury does the human soul have? This is the idea, that the human soul is not like a sort of mathematical computer program, but that it is capable of these enormous passions. Other example, I mean, this painting by Caspar David Friedrich is an example of sublime. He's standing at the edge of the cliff. He could slip at any moment, but he contemplates the vastness of the landscape. Everything is covered in mist. You can't really see it. You can't make out things rationally. And you go, oh my goodness. If this landscape is so beautiful, if this landscape has so much energy, if it's so dynamic, this must be a reflection of the nature of human life and how much more beautiful it is to be a human being who can feel passions, who can feel love, who can feel hatred, who can feel fear, than even just this landscape can reflect. This is the idea of the sublime. You're not thinking about dollars and cents at that moment. You're not thinking about what your next move is going to be to obtain a particular end, you are overwhelmed aesthetically. And of course, even art can produce the feeling of sublime. So that was what Wagner was trying to do with his total work of art in all of his operas, was produce in the viewer a sense of the grandeur and splendor of life, such that they are not thinking rationally, it defies all calculation, ability to think mathematically about things, and also that they experience a form of death. Now, not literal death, but ego death. That when you're in Beirut watching the Ring Cycle over the course of 2 days, it's like 12 hours of opera each day. When you're watching those operas, you are transported into another realm. The I, the ego no longer exists, and you are purely immersed in an aesthetic experience. Which, if any of you have ever gone to a dramatic production that's been very good or high quality, or you've ever watched a film that has completely and totally absorbed you, you may have some sense of this, of what it is to forget about the self for a period of time because you are so absorbed in a work of art. That idea is the sublime. Good. Continuing forward, number 4, a detest of industrial progress and a positive regard for nature, I mentioned earlier. But the detest of industrial progress, again, this idea that we have used reason and we've abused reason. And our abuse of reason and the focusing on what would be the lowest aspects of human beings, dollars, cents, making money, dominating nature, engineering, so on and so forth, those are inferior to the passions and to the emotions. And so for that reason, we see a strong amount of anti-industrial sentiment, more so in the British context than the American context, but this emerges. And particularly in Southern Romanticism in the United States, we see this. Now, the Southern Romantics, like William Gilmore Simms, who's a phenomenal author, everyone should read William Gilmore Simms, but they don't get talked about as much precisely because canon wars. I mean, after the period of 1861, there's sort of a collective decision to forget about those authors. And by 1950, almost no one other than specialists reads them. But I can assure you, if you look at Southern Romanticism, you're going to see a lot of anti-industrial sentiment. Particularly as we get closer to the Civil War, those authors in like the 1850s, they're going to look at what's going on in New England, and they're going to sort of put as much bad press on what happens in New England as possible. Saying things like, oh, well, you know, putting a bunch of 12-year-old girls in a factory makes you superior to us, right? I'm sure we believe that. And you see that sort of, there's an ideological component to that anti-industrial sentiment that comes out in the South. If you have questions on that or questions on anything else, please leave them in the comments. Like I said, I always love receiving comments. I read all of them, and I'm more than happy to answer questions. I was a teacher, and I've been teaching for almost 8 years, so I'm very used to it. Number 5, looking to the past for inspiration. We talked about this a little bit, more so in the European context than in the American context, because the European context has more of a past to look to. You can look at the Roman ruins, you can look at the medieval Catholic past, you can look at folktales and legends, which this is the great period of the recuperation of folktales. So for example, the Brothers Grimm collect their folk stories during the period of Romanticism, because the idea is, hey, let's gather stories from every part of Germany and put them in one book in a type of German that everyone can understand. That way we can build a common German sentiment. So this idea of nationalism. We can identify what it is to be German. What is the German soul? What is the German spirit? What is the German mind? And we'll do that by looking at the past. And so there's an attempt to recover folktales and to recover epics. So this is the period where in Spain, all of a sudden you have the big study of El Cantar de Mio Cid. This is the period where in France, you start to see the big studies of the Chanson de Roland. Everyone is trying to find what is our epic and where can we find out who we are and where we came from. And in fact, what's going to happen in America is because there are no folktales, because there are no legends, because there are no epics, there are going to be attempts to create them. So for example, Longfellow, who's one of the fireside poets that I talked about earlier, he's going to write an epic where he tries to write a story that is a microcosm of the American experience, which is the Song of Hiawatha. And we will read the Song of Hiawatha together. You'll also see, for example, like Washington Irving will just make up folktales. They're not stories that actually happened or have been passed down, but he'll present them through this character of Geoffrey Crayon as stories that they seem like they could have been passed down, but it's just invented folktales because America doesn't have a folk history. It's a new nation. Or James Fenimore Cooper when he invents the character of Leatherstocking or the Trapper or whatever you want to call him, Natty Bumppo. He's invented out of whole cloth, but he's invented so that America can have a folk hero like other nations. So in the European context, it's much more looking into the past and the American context is much more an inventing of the past. Presentation of language for the common man. Yeah, when you read 19th century, like if you read Wordsworth for the first time, you go, common people don't speak like this. And you would be right in saying that. But the poetry of the Romantics is far more colloquial and far more, how should I say this? It uses and quite frankly abuses less of the neoclassical allusions to, oh, Juno, a hyacinth, like all this sort of very florid, over-the-top neoclassical poetry. We get rid of that and we try to present poetry in a language that normal people who don't have a classical education in the Greco-Roman world can understand. Now, is the day laborer going to be reading Wordsworth or Emerson? Probably not, but it is closer to common language. It's not vernacular yet. We only get the vernacular when that's not 100% true. We only start to see the dominance of vernacular in literature in the period of realism. Prior to that, there is some use of vernacular in some of the Romantic poetry, but generally speaking, Romantic poetry represents a movement more towards the speech of common men. And then finally, development of nationalism, the emergence of the nation state, and an attempt to find out what is our identity. If the monarchies are collapsing, if Christendom, broadly speaking, is collapsing, well, then we need to find a new valence for all that cathected energy that we put on religion. And so as people become less and less religious, there's a sense that the nation must grow in order to accumulate that psychic energy. And you get the emergence of nation states, of strong senses of culture, identity, both national and regional, national literatures, national arts and craft movements, folk tales, as we've already mentioned. This becomes a big popular concern during the period of Romanticism. And it's particularly concerning for the Americans, which is why we'll see a lot of this in the Knickerbocker School, because Americans are like, we don't have a culture. We speak English. Well, functionally, most of us are Englishmen. And so how do we differentiate ourselves from Britain, essentially? What makes us different? What makes us not Englishmen? And so they have to invent some of this culture whole cloth. And you see actually like the internationalism of the Enlightenment, the idea that, we don't need nations, we don't need kings, we're just going to have an international brotherhood of enlightened men who believe in liberalism. As soon as America is independent and the French Revolution fails, everyone goes, no, actually, America needs to be distinct, and America needs to be different, and America needs a national identity. No more internationalism. Let's go back to the idea of a strong nation state. Let's go back to the idea of having a national culture, even if we have to invent it. And so you'll see that in the Knickerbocker School. Good. We don't need to read this quote from Wordsworth. You're more than welcome to take a look at it yourself, but it's basically just a restating of things I've already said here. So this is Romanticism in a nutshell. As I mentioned in the future lectures, we will give overviews of the specific sub-movements, the Knickerbocker School, Fireside Poets, Transcendentalism, and then finally the Dark Romantics or the American Gothic writers. But I will stop here for today. As always, if you have questions, leave them down below. Like and subscribe. It really does help out the channel. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention I have a program down below called The Scholar's Path, which is all about how to become an intellectual. It's basically the accumulation of everything I've learned in the past 15 years put into a series of 22, if you can believe it, 22 lectures where I tell what I would have liked to have heard as a 15-year-old to the viewer. It's got just about everything you would want to see in a program like that. It's really one of a kind and unique. You can go click the link and just look actually at the topics and the questions that are answered in each of the 22 lectures. I think you'll find them pretty interesting, and you'll see there's really nothing like it anywhere. So go give that a look, like and subscribe as always. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all next time.